I stood in my kitchen watching the thermostat drop another degree when I realized this was actually happening. The reading showed 58 degrees and falling, and outside my window I could see my neighbors gathering in their driveways, breath visible in the February morning air, phones pressed to their ears. It was the third day without heat in Maple Ridge subdivision, and the 80 homes in our community were about to become uninhabitable if something didn't change fast. My name is Greg Morrison, and I'd lived in this northern Indiana neighborhood just outside South Bend for 6 years. I worked as an accountant at a local firm, kept to myself mostly, paid my HOA dues on time, and never caused trouble. The subdivision was nice enough, built in 2015 on what used to be farmland, with identical two-story colonials in beige and gray, manicured lawns, and strict rules about everything from mailbox colors to when you could put your trash cans out. I'd bought here because the schools were good and the commute was reasonable, not because I wanted to be part of some overzealous community association. But here we were. The trouble had started about 3 months earlier, though I didn't know it at the time. Our HOA board president, a woman named Patricia Sullivan, had apparently decided that the subdivision needed to renegotiate the easement agreement with the landowner whose property our gas line crossed. The gas line ran underground from the main distribution point on County Road 17, across about 200 yards of farmland owned by a man named Harold Chen, and then into our subdivision where it branched out to service all 80 homes. Harold Chen was 74 years old, a retired engineer who'd owned that land for 40 years. He'd sold the parcel that became Maple Ridge to the developers back in 2014, but kept the surrounding farmland where he grew soybeans and corn. The original easement agreement, signed when the subdivision was built, gave the gas company and the HOA the right to maintain the pipeline across his property. In exchange, the HOA paid him $1 per year, which was standard for this type of arrangement. The gas company handled all maintenance, everyone was happy, and the system had worked perfectly for over a decade. Then Patricia decided it wasn't fair. I first heard about this at the January HOA meeting, which I'd attended only because they were voting on whether to repave the community tennis courts. I sat in the back of the community center conference room, one of maybe 15 homeowners who'd bothered to show up out of 80 total households. Patricia stood at the front, her blonde hair styled in that aggressive bob cut that seemed to be required for women of a certain type, wearing a burgundy blazer over a white blouse. "As many of you know," she announced, tapping her papers on the podium, "I've been reviewing all of our association's contracts and agreements. It's my duty as board president to ensure we're getting fair value for our community." I remember thinking that sounded ominous. I've discovered that we're paying Mr. Chen, who owns the farmland to our east, for an easement that he has no right to charge us for. The pipeline serves our community. We should have full rights to that land without any payment whatsoever. A man named Tom raised his hand. "But isn't it his property? Don't we need his permission to have the line there?" Patricia's smile was tight. "The pipeline is essential infrastructure. I've consulted with our attorney and we have options. I'm proposing we renegotiate this agreement from a position of strength." I should have paid more attention. I should have asked questions. Instead, I voted yes on the tennis courts and went home, thinking the board knew what they were doing. 3 weeks later, I got a letter in my mailbox from the HOA. It explained that due to ongoing negotiations regarding essential infrastructure easements, there might be temporary service disruptions. The letter was vague and bureaucratic, and I'd tossed it on my kitchen counter without much thought. Natural gas service seemed like something that would never actually be disrupted. It was a utility. It was reliable. It just worked. I was wrong. The gas stopped flowing on February 14th, Valentine's Day, which seemed almost poetic in its cruelty. I woke up that Saturday morning to a cold house and a thermostat that showed the furnace was calling for heat, but not receiving any. I checked the pilot light, checked the circuit breakers, and finally called the gas company. They told me they were aware of an issue affecting the entire Maple Ridge subdivision and were working to resolve it. By that evening, my house was down to 62 degrees. I'd pulled out space heaters from the basement, but 80 homes suddenly running electric heat was straining the electrical grid, and I worried about overloading the circuits. My girlfriend Wendy Harris had come over for dinner, and we ended up eating takeout Chinese food bundled in sweaters. "This is ridiculous," Wendy said, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, hands wrapped around a mug of hot tea. "How does an entire subdivision lose gas in 2026? What did the company say?" "Just that they're working on it." I checked my phone for the 100th time, looking for updates from the HOA or the gas company. Nothing. The next day, Sunday, I got an emergency email from Patricia Sullivan. The message was long and defensive, but the core facts were clear. Harold Chen had shut off the gas line at the valve on his property. He'd done this, according to Patricia, because the HOA had attempted to negotiate in good faith, and he'd responded with unreasonable demands and hostility. What the email didn't say was what had actually happened during those negotiations. I found that out on Monday, when I ran into my neighbor Marcus Williams at the gas station. Marcus was on the HOA board as treasurer, a younger guy in his 30s who'd always struck me as reasonable. "Greg, man, this whole situation is insane," Marcus said, pumping gas into his Honda. "I tried to stop it. I voted against Patricia's approach, but she and the other 2 board members outvoted me." "What exactly did she do?" Marcus glanced around like he was worried about being overheard. "She sent Mr. Chen a letter demanding he relinquish the easement payment and threatening to sue him for extortion if he didn't comply. She claimed paying him anything was illegal and that the HOA would take him to court and force the easement through eminent domain." I stared at him. "She threatened the guy who controls our gas line?" "It gets worse. When he didn't respond to the letter, she showed up at his house with 2 other board members and told him they were going to have the county condemn his property if he didn't cooperate. She accused him of holding the community hostage." Jesus Christ. "Yeah, so he exercised his legal right to deny access to his property. The easement agreement has a clause that says if the HOA tries to modify the terms unilaterally, he can revoke access with 30 days' notice. He sent that notice 4 weeks ago, but Patricia didn't tell anyone. She thought he was bluffing." The temperature that night dropped to 18 degrees. My house got down to 54, even with space heaters running in every room. I wore thermal underwear to bed and piled on every blanket I owned. When I woke up Tuesday morning, I could see my breath inside my bedroom. The community was in chaos. The Maple Ridge Facebook group, normally full of posts about lost cats and recommendations for lawn services, had exploded with angry messages. People were demanding answers, threatening lawsuits, talking about hotels and temporary housing. Families with small children were especially panicked. One woman posted that her newborn baby couldn't stay in a house this cold, and she was going to her mother's in Fort Wayne. I drove to work that morning with my heat blasting, dreading the moment I'd have to go home. The office felt like paradise, warm and normal. My coworker Linda noticed I was wearing the same shirt I'd worn the day before. "Rough morning?" she asked. "No heat at home. 3rd day now." "Wait, you're in that subdivision, aren't you?" "Maple Ridge. I saw something on the news about that." She pulled up a local news website on her computer. The headline read, "South Bend subdivision left in the cold after HOA dispute." The article quoted a spokesperson from the gas company explaining that they couldn't restore service because the pipeline crossed private property and the landowner had revoked access. It mentioned that 80 families were affected and that local emergency services were monitoring the situation. What it didn't mention was that this was entirely Patricia Sullivan's fault. That evening, the HOA called an emergency meeting. The community center was packed, every chair filled, people standing along the walls. I counted at least 60 homeowners, more than I'd ever seen at any meeting before. The temperature in the room was tense, angry voices overlapping as people demanded explanations. Patricia stood at the front with the other board members, Sharon Rodriguez, the secretary, a thin woman in her 50s with graying hair, Keith Anderson, vice president, a bald man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, and Marcus, who sat slightly apart from the others, arms crossed. "I want to thank everyone for coming," Patricia began, but she was immediately drowned out by shouting, "Our house is 50 degrees. My kids are sleeping at my sister's house. What the hell were you thinking?" Patricia raised her hands. "Please, everyone, let me explain the situation. Mr. Chen is acting irrationally and illegally. He cannot simply shut off essential utilities because of a contract dispute. We are pursuing all legal remedies, and I assure you this will be resolved shortly." A woman near the front stood up. I recognized her as Jennifer Palmer, a lawyer who lived on Oakmont Drive. Patricia, I've reviewed the easement agreement. Mr. Chen is completely within his rights. The agreement explicitly states that any attempt to modify the terms allows him to revoke access with 30 days' notice. You triggered that clause. That clause is unenforceable, Patricia shot back. Our attorney has advised us that your attorney is wrong or you're misrepresenting what he said. I called the gas company today. They confirmed that they cannot access the pipeline without the landowner's permission. They're caught in the middle of this, and they're not going to risk a trespassing lawsuit to restore service. The room erupted again. People were yelling over each other, demanding Patricia's resignation, threatening to sue the HOA. I saw one man actually throw his hands up and walk out, shouting that he was going to a hotel and the HOA could pay for it. Marcus stood up and gradually the room quieted. Look, everyone, I know you're angry. You have every right to be. But we need to focus on solutions. The fastest way to get heat back is to resolve this with Mr. Chen. We need to apologize, reinstate the original agreement, and ask him to restore access. Absolutely not, Patricia said. That would be admitting we were wrong. We were wrong, Marcus said flatly. You were wrong. You picked a fight we didn't need to pick, and now 80 families are suffering because of it. Sharon spoke up for the first time. Patricia, maybe we should consider Marcus's suggestion. The situation has become untenable. If we back down now, we look weak, Patricia insisted. Mr. Chen will think he can push us around whenever he wants. We need to stand firm and pursue our legal options. Jennifer Palmer laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. Your legal options are going to take months. Patricia, even if you could somehow force the easement through eminent domain, which I seriously doubt, it would require county approval, environmental studies, public hearings. We're talking 6 months minimum, probably longer. People can't live without heat for 6 months. I finally raised my hand and stood up. How much was the original easement payment? Patricia looked at me like I'd asked something stupid. $1 per year. So you're telling me that you destroyed this community's access to heat over $1 per year? The room went silent. People stared at Patricia. It's not about the money, she said, her voice rising. It's about the principle. We shouldn't have to pay anything for essential infrastructure on our own property. It's not our property, Jennifer Palmer said. That's the entire point. The pipeline crosses his land. He owns that land. He has the right to control access to it. Then we'll reroute the pipeline, Patricia said desperately. We'll find another way to connect to the gas main. Marcus shook his head. I already looked into that. It would cost approximately $400,000 to reroute the line around his property. That's $5,000 per household. Plus, it would take at least 4 months to engineer, permit, and construct. This is not a viable solution. The meeting devolved into shouting again. People were demanding immediate action, threatening recalls, talking about legal liability. Keith Anderson, the vice president who'd barely spoken, suddenly announced he was resigning from the board effective immediately. He stood up, said, "I didn't sign up for this," and walked out of the community center. Patricia was left standing there with Sharon, looking increasingly cornered. Finally, she said she would reach out to Mr. Chen again to attempt another negotiation. The meeting ended with no real resolution, and everyone trudged back to their freezing houses. That night, my house got down to 51 degrees. I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed wearing a winter coat over my pajamas, thinking about how insane this all was. One person's ego and stubbornness had made 80 homes virtually uninhabitable. I thought about the families with kids, the elderly residents, the people who couldn't afford hotels or didn't have family nearby to stay with. Wednesday morning, I decided I'd had enough. I looked up Harold Chen's address, found it was just a quarter mile down County Road 17, and drove over there before work. The farmhouse was old but well-maintained, a white 2-story with a wraparound porch and a red barn in back. I parked in the gravel driveway and knocked on the front door, half expecting to be told to get lost. Harold Chen answered the door himself. He was a small man, maybe 5'6", with white hair and glasses, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. He looked at me warily. "Mr. Chen, my name is Greg Morrison. I live in Maple Ridge. I was hoping I could talk to you for a few minutes." He studied me for a moment. "You're not with the HOA board?" "No, sir. I'm just a homeowner. I'm not here to threaten you or make demands. I just wanted to understand what happened and see if there's any way to fix this." He considered, then stepped back and gestured for me to come inside. The house was warm, and I felt an almost physical relief at being out of the cold. He led me to a kitchen that smelled like coffee and toast. "You want some coffee?" he asked. "Yes, please." We sat at his kitchen table, and he poured 2 mugs from a pot on the counter. For a moment, we just drank in silence. "I'm not a bad person," Harold finally said. "I don't want people to suffer. I don't want children living in cold houses. But I also don't appreciate being bullied on my own property." "I understand. Can you tell me what happened?" "All I know is what I've heard secondhand." He sighed and pulled out a folder from a drawer. Inside were copies of letters and emails. He showed me the first letter from Patricia, dated January 3rd. It was worse than Marcus had described. Patricia had written that the HOA was no longer willing to subsidize your extortionate demands and that payment for the gas line easement constitutes an illegal restraint of trade. She demanded he sign a new agreement relinquishing all payments and granting permanent, irrevocable access or face legal action. "I called my own lawyer after getting this," Harold said. "He told me she was completely wrong legally, but that I should try to resolve it peacefully. So I wrote back offering to meet and discuss it. I even said I'd consider lowering the payment if money was genuinely an issue for the HOA, though obviously $1 a year isn't a real financial burden." He showed me his response letter. It was polite and reasonable. Patricia's second letter was not. She'd written that his refusal to cooperate proved he was acting in bad faith and that the HOA would be seeking to have the county exercise eminent domain to seize the easement. She'd also threatened to sue him personally for the cost of alternative heating for all 80 homes. "That's when I sent the revocation notice," Harold said. "The easement agreement is clear. If they try to unilaterally change the terms, I can revoke access with 30 days' notice. I gave them 30 days. I even stated in my notice that I would reconsider if they withdrew their threats and reinstated the original agreement." "Did they respond?" "Your board president showed up here with 2 other people, a woman and a man. They stood on my porch and told me I was going to regret this. The president said I was a bitter old man trying to squeeze money out of young families. She said the HOA would destroy me in court and that I'd lose my farm. She was yelling, aggressive. I asked them to leave. They refused until I threatened to call the sheriff. I put my head in my hands. Mr. Chen, I'm so sorry. This is insane. Most of us had no idea any of this was happening until the gas shut off. I believe you. I don't blame the homeowners, but I do blame your board. And I'm not going to be threatened and harassed on my own land. I'm 74 years old. I've owned this property for 4 decades. I've never had a single problem with easements or neighbors until your HOA decided $1 a year was too much." "What would it take to fix this?" I asked. "What do you need from us?" He leaned back in his chair. "It's simple. I want the original easement agreement reinstated. I want a written apology from the board acknowledging their threats were inappropriate, and I want assurance that this won't happen again." "That seems incredibly reasonable." "You'd think so, but your board president called me yesterday and demanded I restore gas access immediately, or she'd have me arrested for reckless endangerment." I felt my stomach drop. "She what?" "She said I was criminally liable for any harm that comes to residents due to lack of heat. She said if anyone gets sick or dies, I'll be charged with manslaughter." "That's not how the law works. She can't possibly believe that." Harold shrugged. "I don't know what she believes, but I'm not backing down. I've done nothing wrong. They violated the contract. I exercised my legal rights. If they want gas back, they know what they need to do." I thanked him for his time and headed to work, my mind spinning. The situation was so straightforward. Patricia had screwed up massively, and all she had to do was admit it and fix it, but her ego wouldn't allow it. That afternoon, I started making calls. I contacted every homeowner in Maple Ridge I had numbers for, explaining what I'd learned from Harold Chen and from Marcus. Most people were shocked and furious. Several said they'd already contacted lawyers about suing the HOA for damages. One man told me his wife had asthma and the cold was making it worse, and they were considering filing a police report against the board for reckless endangerment. By Thursday, the news coverage had intensified. A local TV station sent a crew to Maple Ridge. They interviewed shivering homeowners, showed footage of children bundled in coats inside houses, and questioned the HOA's decision-making. Patricia refused to appear on camera, but they got a quote from her via email where she blamed Harold Chen for holding the community hostage over money. The station also interviewed Harold. He came across as calm, reasonable, and sympathetic. He explained the easement agreement, showed the reporter Patricia's threatening letters, and said he'd be happy to restore access the moment the HOA reinstated the original terms. The reporter's conclusion was damning. "So you're telling me this entire crisis is over $1 per year, and the HOA board president refused to back down even after 80 families lost heat?" "That's correct," Harold said. The story went viral locally. By Friday, it had been picked up by regional news outlets across Indiana and Michigan. The national media started calling it the $1 dispute. Social media was ruthless, with thousands of people mocking Patricia and the Maple Ridge HOA board. Inside the community, a group of homeowners organized a petition to recall the entire board. Within 24 hours, they had signatures from 63 of the 80 households. They scheduled a special meeting for Saturday morning to vote on the recall. Friday night, my house hit 49 degrees. The space heaters couldn't keep up anymore. I packed a bag and drove to Wendy's apartment in South Bend, where I took a hot shower that felt like the greatest luxury in human history. We sat on her couch watching the news coverage of the situation, and I felt a mix of embarrassment and rage. "Your HOA president is going to get sued into oblivion," Wendy said. "Good. She deserves it." "Do you think she'll actually be arrested?" I'd been wondering the same thing. "I don't know. She hasn't committed a crime exactly. She's just incompetent and stubborn." "What about the threats to Mr. Chen? Can't that be considered harassment?" "Maybe. I know some people are talking about filing complaints with the sheriff's office." Saturday morning, nearly every homeowner showed up to the special meeting. The community center was packed beyond capacity, with people standing outside in the cold. Patricia tried to call the meeting to order, but she was immediately shouted down. Jennifer Palmer stood up and took control. "This meeting is being held under the bylaws provision for emergency recall votes. We have a petition signed by 63 homeowners requesting the immediate removal of Patricia Sullivan as board president and Sharon Rodriguez as secretary. Marcus Williams has agreed to remain as treasurer and will hold elections for new positions once this crisis is resolved." Patricia's face was red. "This is a coup. You can't just remove elected board members because you disagree with their decisions." "We can absolutely remove board members for gross negligence and breach of fiduciary duty," Jennifer shot back. "You've made this community liable for potentially millions of dollars in damages. You've rendered 80 homes uninhabitable. You've harassed a private landowner and exposed us to legal liability. This is far beyond a simple disagreement." The vote was called. 71 homeowners voted to remove Patricia and Sharon. 5 voted against, and 4 abstained. It was overwhelming. Patricia stood up, grabbed her papers, and walked out without another word. Sharon followed her, looking shell-shocked. Jennifer was voted in as interim president. Her first action was to draft a formal letter to Harold Chen. She read it aloud to the meeting. "Dear Mr. Chen, on behalf of the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association, we sincerely apologize for the inappropriate and unprofessional conduct of our former board leadership. The threats and demands made against you were not authorized by the homeowner community and do not reflect our values. We acknowledge that you have acted within your legal rights under the easement agreement. We respectfully request reinstatement of the original easement terms and ask for your cooperation in restoring natural gas service to our community. We understand if you need time to consider this request and appreciate your patience during this difficult situation." The room applauded. Jennifer, Marcus, and 2 other homeowners drove to Harold Chen's farm that afternoon to deliver the letter in person. I wasn't there, but Marcus told me what happened. Harold had invited them in, read the letter carefully, and nodded slowly. "I appreciate this," he'd said. "I appreciate the apology. I accept the reinstatement of the original agreement." "So you'll restore gas access?" Jennifer had asked. "I need to consult with my attorney first just to make sure everything is properly documented. But assuming the paperwork is in order, I'll call the gas company Monday morning and authorize them to access the pipeline." They'd thanked him profusely and driven back to share the news. When word spread through the community, people actually cheered. There was still no heat that night, but knowing it would be resolved soon made it bearable. Sunday, I spent the day at Wendy's place, trying to relax and not think about the disaster my HOA had created. But that evening, I got a call from Marcus that changed everything. "Greg, we have a problem. Patricia filed an injunction." "What?" "She filed an emergency motion in county court Friday afternoon before the recall vote. She's asking a judge to order Mr. Chen to restore gas access immediately and to prevent the HOA from reinstating the easement payment. She's claiming Mr. Chen is violating utility regulations and that the HOA board has exclusive authority to negotiate easements. Can she do that? She's not even on the board anymore. She filed it while she was still president. The hearing is Monday morning at 9. Jennifer is scrambling to get our response filed, but this could delay everything." I couldn't believe it. Even after being removed from the board, Patricia was still fighting. Monday morning, I took a personal day from work and went to the St. Joseph County Courthouse. The courtroom was surprisingly full. Harold Chen was there with his attorney, a sharp-looking woman in her 40s. Jennifer Palmer represented the HOA, along with an attorney the association had hired over the weekend. Patricia was there with her own lawyer, a young man who looked fresh out of law school. The judge was a gray-haired man named Stephen Hughes, who looked thoroughly annoyed to be dealing with this. Patricia's attorney went first, arguing that Harold Chen's shutoff of gas service violated Indiana utility regulations and that the court needed to intervene immediately to protect public health and safety. Judge Hughes interrupted. "Counselor, Mr. Chen is not a utility provider. He's a private landowner who granted an easement. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor. But the effect of his actions. The effect of his actions is that he exercised a right explicitly granted to him in a contract that your client signed. Do you dispute that the easement agreement allows revocation with 30 days' notice if the HOA attempts to modify terms?" "We dispute the validity of that clause, Your Honor." "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that essential utility access cannot be held hostage to private contract disputes." Harold Chen's attorney stood. "Your Honor, may I respond?" "Please." "The pipeline in question is not a public utility. It's privately owned by the gas company, and it crosses my client's private property under an easement agreement negotiated by private parties. The HOA is not entitled to access my client's land without permission any more than they'd be entitled to drive across his front lawn. They had permission. They violated the terms that granted that permission, and my client lawfully revoked it. The fact that this creates hardship for HOA members is unfortunate but legally irrelevant." Judge Hughes nodded. "What is Ms. Sullivan standing to bring this motion? My understanding is that she was removed from the HOA board." Patricia's attorney looked uncomfortable. "She was board president at the time this motion was filed, Your Honor." "And now?" "She was removed by a vote on Saturday. So she no longer represents the HOA." "No, Your Honor." "Then who am I supposed to grant relief to?" "She doesn't have standing to represent the HOA, and she's not personally affected by the gas shutoff because she doesn't live in Maple Ridge." There was a murmur in the courtroom. I hadn't known that. Patricia didn't even live in the community she'd been governing. Her attorney stammered. "Your Honor, Ms. Sullivan is acting in her individual capacity as a concerned citizen." "Motion denied," Judge Hughes said flatly. "Ms. Sullivan has no standing. The underlying legal claim has no merit, and this appears to be a vindictive action by someone who was removed from authority for poor judgment. Mr. Chen, I apologize that the court's time was wasted with this. Counselor Palmer, does the current HOA board intend to pursue this dispute?" Jennifer stood. "No, Your Honor. We've reached an agreement with Mr. Chen to reinstate the original easement terms. We're just waiting for paperwork to be finalized." "Excellent. Then this matter is resolved. We're adjourned." Patricia's face was pale as she left the courtroom. Her attorney was already packing his briefcase and looked like he wanted nothing more to do with her. Outside the courthouse, Harold Chen shook hands with Jennifer and Marcus. "I'll call the gas company this afternoon," he said. "They told me they can restore service within 24 hours once I authorize access." True to his word, the gas company crews were on his property by Tuesday morning. They inspected the pipeline, confirmed everything was functioning properly, and turned the system back on. By Tuesday afternoon, heat was flowing to all 80 homes in Maple Ridge. I got home from work that day and felt the warm air coming through the vents like a miracle. My thermostat climbed steadily, 60, 65, 70. I stood in my living room in just a t-shirt and jeans, feeling my house transform back into a home. The relief was community-wide. People posted on the Facebook group about crying when their furnaces kicked on, about their kids finally being able to sleep in their own beds again, about the simple joy of being warm. It had been 8 days without heat, 8 days that felt like a month. But the story wasn't over. Wednesday morning, 3 homeowners filed a lawsuit against Patricia Sullivan personally and the former HOA board for gross negligence, breach of fiduciary duty, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. They were seeking damages for hotel costs, medical expenses from cold-related illnesses, and punitive damages. By Friday, that lawsuit had become a class action with 47 plaintiffs. The total damages being sought exceeded $2 million. Patricia's homeowner's insurance company denied her claim, stating that her actions fell outside the scope of coverage because she'd acted intentionally and in bad faith. Her personal assets were now at risk. Then the state got involved. The Indiana Attorney General's office opened an investigation into whether Patricia had violated state laws regarding HOA governance. They were looking specifically at whether her threats to Harold Chen constituted criminal harassment and whether her actions met the threshold for criminal recklessness. I followed all of this through news reports and community gossip, feeling a weird mix of satisfaction and pity. Patricia had been so convinced she was right, so unwilling to back down, that she'd destroyed herself. In late February, the county prosecutor filed charges. Patricia Sullivan was charged with 2 counts of harassment based on her threats and aggressive conduct toward Harold Chen, and 1 count of criminal recklessness for knowingly creating a situation that endangered the health and safety of 80 families. The recklessness charge was unusual but legally sound. The prosecutor argued that Patricia had known her actions would result in loss of heat during winter, had been warned about the consequences, and had persisted anyway. Given that the situation had lasted 8 days in sub-freezing temperatures, with several residents requiring medical treatment for cold-related issues, the charge had teeth. Patricia's arrest made regional news. The footage of her being booked at the St. Joseph County Jail was replayed on every local station. She posted bail immediately, but looked haggard and defeated in the courthouse photos. Her trial was set for June. In the meantime, the civil lawsuits proceeded. The HOA's insurance covered the association itself, but not Patricia personally, and her legal bills were mounting. Sharon Rodriguez, the former secretary, was named in the civil suits, but not charged criminally because she'd been a follower rather than a leader. She settled quickly, agreeing to pay $20,000 and cooperate with investigators about what had happened. Through Sharon's testimony, we learned more details. Patricia had apparently convinced herself that Harold Chen was trying to extort the HOA and that standing firm would force him to back down. She'd ignored advice from Marcus and from the HOA's original attorney, who'd warned her she was wrong legally. She'd consulted a second attorney who'd told her what she wanted to hear, and she'd run with it. The whole thing was a case study in how ego and stubbornness could create disaster. In March, the Maple Ridge HOA held elections for a new board. Jennifer Palmer was elected president, Marcus Williams remained treasurer, and 3 other level-headed homeowners joined them. Their first action was to pass a resolution requiring board approval for any contract modifications and requiring consultation with qualified legal counsel before taking any action that could affect essential services. They also sent Harold Chen a fruit basket and a handwritten thank you card signed by all 80 households. Harold, for his part, told a reporter that he harbored no ill will toward the community. "The people of Maple Ridge are good neighbors," he said. "I hope this whole mess taught everyone a lesson about respect and common sense." April brought the civil trial. The class action lawsuit went before a jury, and the evidence was damning. Patricia's threatening letters, the testimony from Harold Chen, the medical records of residents who'd suffered from the cold, the hotel and heating bills totaling tens of thousands of dollars. Patricia's defense was that she'd been acting in what she believed was the community's best interest, but the jury didn't buy it. They awarded the plaintiffs $1.3 million in compensatory damages and $500,000 in punitive damages. Patricia would be paying this debt for the rest of her life. Her criminal trial followed in June. I attended one day of testimony, sitting in the public gallery and watching as prosecutors laid out the timeline of events. Harold Chen testified about the threats and harassment. Several Maple Ridge residents testified about the conditions in their homes during the 8-day period without heat. A mother described her 6-month-old daughter developing a respiratory infection from the cold. An elderly man talked about his wife's hypothermia scare. Patricia's attorney tried to argue that she'd been negligent at worst, not criminal. But the prosecution's closing argument was powerful. The defendant was told repeatedly and clearly that her actions would result in 80 families losing heat in the middle of winter. She was given multiple opportunities to fix the situation. She chose, consciously and deliberately, to let those families suffer rather than admit she was wrong. That's not negligence, that's recklessness, that's a criminal disregard for human welfare. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They found her guilty on both harassment charges and on the criminal recklessness charge. Sentencing came in July. The judge gave Patricia Sullivan 6 months in county jail for the harassment charges and 18 months for criminal recklessness, to be served concurrently. She'd do 18 months total, with possible early release for good behavior. Additionally, she was ordered to pay restitution to the HOA for legal fees and to the individual homeowners for documented expenses related to the gas shutoff. I watched the sentencing from the courtroom gallery. Patricia stood silently as the judge delivered the sentence, her expression blank. When it was over, she was led out in handcuffs. It was a stunning fall for someone who'd been so convinced of her own righteousness just 6 months earlier. The local news covered the sentencing extensively, and the story picked up national attention again. Think pieces were written about HOA overreach, about the dangers of unchecked authority and neighborhood associations, about how a $1 dispute had led to criminal convictions. For me and my neighbors in Maple Ridge, life gradually returned to normal. The new HOA board was competent and reasonable. They renegotiated the landscaping contract to save money, organized a community cleanup day, and stayed far away from anything controversial. Harold Chen continued farming his land. He and I actually became friendly. I'd stop by occasionally to chat, and he'd tell me stories about the old days before the subdivision existed, when the whole area was farmland. He seemed to harbor no bitterness about what had happened, viewing it as an unfortunate but educational experience. Wendy and I got engaged in August, and we decided to stay in Maple Ridge despite everything. The house was solid, the neighbors were good people, and the HOA was now run by folks with common sense. We figured we'd gotten all our bad luck out of the way in one concentrated dose. The incident became local legend. Whenever anyone talked about HOA horror stories, the $1 dispute came up. It was taught as a cautionary tale in local law schools and business classes about contract law, fiduciary duty, and the importance of knowing when to back down. For me, the biggest lesson was about the danger of letting principle override common sense. Patricia Sullivan had convinced herself that she was fighting for something important, that $1 per year was somehow worth a battle. She'd let her ego blind her to the consequences of her actions, and she'd paid an enormous price for it. But 80 families had paid a price too. We'd spent 8 days in the cold, scared and angry and helpless, because one person couldn't admit she was wrong. Some of the elderly residents never quite recovered from the stress. Some families moved away as soon as they could, not wanting to risk another crisis. As for Patricia, she was released from jail after 13 months. She'd lost her house to pay the civil judgments, lost her reputation, and would carry a criminal record for the rest of her life. Last I heard, she'd moved to Ohio to live with family, trying to start over somewhere nobody knew her story. I sometimes wonder if she ever truly understood what she'd done wrong, or if she still believed she'd been fighting the good fight. I hope she learned something, but I honestly don't know. What I do know is that every year on February 14th, the anniversary of the gas shutoff, I make a point to appreciate my warm house a little extra. I think about how fragile our comfort really is, how it depends on infrastructure and agreements and cooperation between people. And I'm grateful that we have a competent HOA board now, people who understand that leadership means serving the community, not serving your ego. The whole experience changed how I view local governance. I pay attention now to who's running for the HOA board and what their priorities are. I attend meetings regularly, I ask questions. Because I learned the hard way that apathy and disengagement create vacuums that get filled by people like Patricia Sullivan, people who think they know better than everyone else and who won't listen to reason. Our annual easement payment to Harold Chen is still $1, and every year when Jennifer Palmer presents him with a crisp new dollar bill at the spring HOA meeting, the whole room applauds. It's become a tradition, a reminder of what we went through and how we came out the other side. Harold usually makes a little speech about being good neighbors and working together, and then he donates the dollar to the Community Scholarship Fund. It's symbolic, really. It always was. The payment was never about the money. It was about respect and following the rules and honoring agreements. Patricia Sullivan never understood that. She saw a dollar payment as weakness, as being taken advantage of. She couldn't see that it was actually the price of cooperation, the cost of maintaining relationships, the small gesture that made everything else work smoothly. $1 per year to heat 80 homes. It was the best deal we ever had, and we almost lost it, because one person thought she was smarter than a contract that had worked perfectly for a decade. I still live in Maple Ridge. My house is warm. The HOA functions properly. Harold Chen still waves when I drive past his farm. Life is good and normal and boring in exactly the way it should be. And every winter when I turn up the thermostat and feel that rush of warm air, I remember those 8 days in February when we learned that comfort can disappear in an instant if the wrong person gets a little bit of power and refuses to let go of being right. The gas line still runs under Harold Chen's property, same as it has for over a decade. The easement agreement is still in force, unchanged from the original terms. Everything is exactly as it was before Patricia Sullivan decided to pick a fight. Sometimes the best decision is to change nothing at all.